The Calvinists will say that that God, if God allows certain things to occur in the universe that he did not decree or that he did not determine, then God is no longer sovereign. But he's not, because God must be sovereign over all things. And so
I guess I was muted that whole time that I was talking. Sorry about that. You missed the intro, but cool songs, right? Okay, we'll just continue here.
if God, and this is the mistake that John Calvin made. I'll take my glasses off here for a second, because John Calvin said that if anything is permitted to occur in the universe that was not directly determined by God's will, then the universe moves at random, and that things are left to fortune. And Calvin could not emotionally cope with the possibility that anything in the universe could move at random or could be left to fortune. Because if that's the case, there are some things that God does not have control over, and he falls apart. If that's the case, Calvin loses his mind and he has a nervous breakdown. And the whole thing is rooted in a faulty definition of sovereignty. For the Calvinists and for John Calvin, God's sovereignty is his causality over all of creation.
All right, there it is, guys. That's our new intro since you missed mine. God's sovereignty is his causality over his entire creation. That's what his claim is, that the way that Calvinists understand God's sovereignty. And as I said in the intro that you missed, we're doing things a little different tonight, because for this claim, I have prepared a doctrinal refutation that's probably going to take us a couple of hours to get through, to be honest with you. And we're going to be slowing it down here first. I am going to allow them to present their alternate view of what they claim is the Calvinistic view or Reformed view of God's sovereignty before I go into it, because again, it's going to take us a while. We're not going to spend much time on flowers today. Again, this is a misunderstanding. Something you guys missed in the intro again is this is just a complete either lack of understanding or maybe a lack of knowledge of, or maybe intentionally not bringing it to the table. I'm not sure. But what did you guys do? Did you go blank? Sorry. Hopefully I can prevent that from happening when I switch to read my thing, because I prepared a big thing here. Okay, it didn't black out that time. Okay, so I think we're good. Sorry about that, guys. We're going to be talking about something that's called the Doctrine of Concursus. Okay, and this, as it was understood by not only John Calvin, many other scholars, expressed in the Westminster Confession of Faith, this theological and philosophical distinction that Flowers apparently has absolutely no knowledge of, for him to explain and nod his head while this guy says that God's sovereignty is his causality over all of his creation. So again, first, let's let them give their alternate view of God's sovereignty, and then I'm going to go into the refutation.
And I think that's a faulty, and I think it's an unfortunate definition of God's.
And it is a faulty definition. It's a faulty definition that's called hyper-Calvinism.
Sovereignty, and it leads to all sorts of problems that are ultimately unresolvable. And I would argue that the proper definition of God's sovereignty is lordship over free creatures, that God is the authority, the ultimate authority of the universe. He's the moral authority of the universe. The universe is is obligated to do his will, but God's not going to cause the universe to do his will. He's going to cause some of what he has created to do his will and bidding, but he's not going to cause the what I would call the libertarian free choices, but he's not going to cause the choices of human beings that he has created. But he has ultimate authority over all those choices, and we will answer to him for all those choices. That's what sovereignty means.
Yeah.
Is that all of creation will answer to God ultimately.
Yeah.
And
what better way to steelman a Calvinist than to let a leading Calvinist make this exact point? Many of you are familiar with R.C. Sproul. He's gone on to be with the Lord now, but he's got very well known for the whole no maverick molecule kind of argument. And so I want you to hear it for yourself here in this clip, and then we'll kind of engage with it. I don't think we'll listen to the whole 6 minutes here, but I just want you to hear it for yourself, this argument from an actual Calvinist. Listen.
When I was teaching seminary, I was responsible to teach a course on the theology of the Westminster Confession of Faith. The Westminster Confession of Faith is a 17th century theological document that was the confessional foundation for historic Presbyterianism. And we had come to the place in the confession where I was going to have to teach chapter 3 the following week. And chapter 3 is entitled On the Eternal Decrees of God. Now, among Presbyterians, they know exactly what that means. They said,
Okay, we've heard enough. They're going to let RC speak for a while. That's not necessary. We're going to actually go into it a little more detail than what RC went into, at least publicly, because there's actually a lot of information out there on this topic. And so we're going to go ahead and get into that now. And we're going to start off with the assertion that for the Calvinist and for John Calvin, God's sovereignty is his causality over all of creation. Now, even saying that represents a fundamental category error in the field of not only historical and but also systematic theology in general. And for someone who has spent a good portion of his life studying this very system of theology, it's surprising to me that he seems to be unaware. On the surface, it might seem like a minor semantic distinction, equating sovereignty strictly with causality, particularly immediate, efficient causality, which is what these guys are suggesting. Having that view collapses the robust, multi-layered architecture of Reformed orthodoxy into a flat, mechanical determinism, often described as hyper-Calvinism or even fatalism. In this video today, I'm going to provide an exhaustive refutation of this reductionist view, demonstrating that with Reformed theology, God's sovereignty is defined by his authority, ordination, and governance, which are executed through a complex, organic network of secondary causes, contingent events, and the free agency of creatures. Right? So, the only thing these guys are recognizing in their formula is God's authority and the free agency of creatures. All of those other vast theological and philosophical concepts, philosophy drawn from the text, are completely missing from their equation, as if they are just not aware that they exist. So we're going to go into a deep explanation of that. I've got a drink here, so thank you. Me doing a lot of talking tonight. Our refutation today is going to rest on critical Christian philosophy and an important theological distinction between the decree of God, which is his eternal plan, spoken before the foundation of the world, and the actual execution of that decree, which is his temporal providence. To assert that God is the cause of all things in an undifferentiated sense is to make him the author of sin. This is a position that John Calvin, the Westminster Divines, and practically all Reformed scholastics, Francis Turretin, and many others vehemently rejected. Instead, Reformed theology posits that while God is the first cause of all being, he is not the efficient cause of individual human actions in a way that bypasses their nature. Specifically regarding evil and sin, God acts not as a generator of malice, but as a sovereign judge who employs the deficient causality of sinful creatures to accomplish his holy ends without producing the sin itself. Well, today, through a detailed analysis of many historical texts, confessional standards, specifically from the Westminster Confession of Faith again, and a couple of biblical case studies, notably the lying spirit in 1 Kings 22, the betrayal of Judas Iscariot. We're going to explicate the Reformed doctrine of concursus. And this doctrine maintains that God's sovereignty establishes, rather than negates, the liberty and contingency of secondary causes. God has designed an organic universe that acts out his decree through its own properties and agencies. He's the creator who sustains the stage and the actors, but the actors play their parts according to their own natures which God has decreed, but does not override by a mechanical hand. So kind of the first big section of our study here is going to be based on the metaphysics of sovereignty, according to the Reformed understanding and as presented by Scripture. And to properly refute this equation that they have of sovereignty being causality, you have to first dissect how Reformed theology understands the relationship between the creator and the creature. The reductionist view implies a univocal relationship where God's action and human action occupy the same plane, right? As if they're competing for space, right? But Reformed theology operates on an analogical plane where God's primary causality functions on a different level than creaturely secondary causality. In the Institutes of the Christian Religion, John Calvin expounds on God's sovereignty not only as an energy that moves atoms, or not merely as an energy that moves atoms, but as a kingly rule, as this man has suggested, right? But he's saying he's just giving him the title of king and just saying only that it means that we will answer to him one day, right? And there's no other description of what it means to be king through him. There's no exhaustive search through the Bible of what it means for God to be sovereign explained. It's just he gives them the title of authority and doesn't follow through with what that authority means. He's right that sovereignty refers to God's right and power to govern his creation to his appointed ends. That's true. And while this governance involves power, it's not reducible to a kinetic transfer of energy, right? As in, God is making the same kind of kinetic, energetic response that our brains and our will makes when we are performing an action. He is not causing that kinetic activity, right? That's what I'm trying to make the distinction between the planes where God's decree exists and the planes where humans' actions exist. If sovereignty were synonymous with causality, then every act of a creature would be a direct act of God, right? And that's the way that they think Reformed theology presents God's sovereignty, and as if every action that takes place is just God acting. This is a view. People have this view, and it's called occasionalism. It suggests that creatures are merely occasions for God to act. For Reformed theology rejects that vehemently. As noted in the critique of distorted interpretations of Calvin, he says it were insipid to interpret the psalmist's words in philosophic fashion to mean that God is the primary agent, because the beginning and cause of all motion. Instead, sovereignty is the ordination of the end and the means. God's sovereignty is his lordship attribute. This is something that they would agree with, but they don't go on to fill in, right? It encompasses his decreative will. What God has determined will take place, and his preceptive will. This is something we've talked about before. His preceptive will is what God commands. The failure to distinguish these leads to the error of assuming that because God is sovereign over a sinful act, his decreative will, he must be the cause of it in the same way he is the cause of righteousness. However, Reformed theology maintains that while God is the efficient cause of good working in believers to will and to work, he is related to evil differently, by way of sovereign ordination and governance, but not efficient production. A primary philosophical distinction that's important to make to understand this is, again, the distinction between primary and secondary causes. The most robust tool in the Reformed arsenal for refuting mechanical determinism is the distinction between primary and secondary causes. The distinction is enshrined in the Westminster Confession of Faith. Chapter 3, paragraph 1 says, God from all eternity did freely and unchangeably ordain whatsoever comes to pass. Yet, so as thereby neither is God the author of sin, nor is violence offered to the will of the creatures, nor is the liberty or contingency of second causes taken away, but rather established. So you have the primary cause. This is God, the first cause of all things, as the creator, in terms of their origin, right? Ex nihilo, from nothing. He is the cause in that sense. And their sustentation, right? The providence. No molecule moves without his power upholding its existence. In this sense, he is the cause because he is the creator and the sustainer, right? That's the primary cause of all things. The secondary cause refers to the agency of the creature or the operation of natural laws. Right? Fire burns because it's the nature of fire to burn. A bird flies because it has wings. A man chooses because he has a will. These are true causes. They're not illusory, right? They're not an illusion. They are really taking place in reality. Reformed theology insists that God's decree does not replace these causes. He only renders them certain. And this is again taking place on another plane, higher than our plane that our actions are existing on. The assertion that sovereignty is causality collapses this vertical hierarchy into a horizontal line. If God is the only cause, then the universe is just a puppet show. But as Turretin argues, the mode of working follows the mode of being. God creates a universe with distinct natures. When he executes his decree, he does so through these natures. He does not force a stone to think or a man to fall continuously like a stone. He governs them according to the properties that he gave them. Therefore, the refutation stands on the premise that God causes the agents to exist and sustains their power to act, but the specific actions are caused by the agents themselves in accordance with their nature, which was given to them by God. Okay, so now we're going to lay out this doctrine of concursus, which you could also say in English, the divine concurrence. And this is the fact that this doctrine isn't discussed in the many videos. Maybe it has been. Maybe he'll show, oh, I did discuss this doctrine. But okay, if not, here we go. So we have to bridge the gap between God's absolute sovereignty and real human agency. That gap does have to be bridged philosophically. We can't just turn our backs on it. We can't just say, oh, we have faith that that gap is bridged. We can bridge it, right? It's been done actually for a long time, right? It's been developed again in a doctrine called concursus. This doctrine teaches that divine activity runs parallel to and concurs with the activity of people and things. And concurrence resolves the dichotomy between acts of God and acts of man. An event is simultaneously an act of the creature, right? That's a proximate cause, right? Is proximate in relation to the plane of existence where the action is taking place, right? An act of God is a remote cause, right? Coming from outside of the plane. So the quality of the act is attributed to the proximate cause, not the remote cause, plainly speaking. That's important, and we'll discuss why soon. So in the material of the act taking place, right? Here on the material plane, the physical energy that's required to swing a sword or to utter a lie, the physical energy that it is required to do those things, that energy comes from God, right? The fact that your molecules are sustained for the duration of your sword swing, right? Because in him we live and move and have our being. That's what that means, right? A formal quality of the act is the intent and moral nature of the swing, right? or the utterance of the lie, and that belongs to the creature, right? The intent and the moral nature of the act comes from the heart of the creature taking the act. The physical energy that's required to perform the act comes from God and is sustained and decreed by God, right? Francis Turretin distinguishes between physical concurrence, God flowing into the effect effectively, and moral concurrence, God persuading or proposing objects. In the production of natural effects, God concurs physically, right? In the production of sinful acts, God provides the ontological power, right? The ability to speak or the ability to move, but withdraws the moral restraint or simply allows the creature's own defect to manifest. So, in this way, sovereignty is not causality in the sense of God forcing the person's hand. It is God energizing the universe such that the universe is able to act. As Bavinck notes, concurrence is precisely the reason for the self-activity of the secondary cause. This is far from negating the creature's causality. God's sovereignty is the battery that makes the creature's causality possible. Okay? That's kind of the first part. Anyone have any questions kind of about that stuff that we discussed? I'll take a break for a second. And that is the metaphysics behind God's sovereignty. And again, the idea that Leighton doesn't already know that is preposterous to me. I feel pretty certain that he does know that that is the Reformed view of the metaphysics of God's sovereignty. I'm just going to take 2 minutes to drink this water. I'll be right back. Not 2 full minutes. I'm back already. Okay, guys, let's go into the next part, okay? So we already mentioned this distinction. It's such an important distinction to make. And these aren't just wild-eyed distinctions, right? These are real philosophical distinctions that you may not be capable of making, but listen closely, and I'm going to try my best to explain it, okay? Our part 2 distinction here that we are drawing is the distinction between God's decree and the execution of God's decree. Right? It's the fatal flaw in the statement that sovereignty is causality. The conflation of the internal acts of God, the decree, with the external acts of God, execution, creation, providence, right? He's conflating those two categories. That God has an internal act, an internal will, right? As like any being does, the thoughts on the inside, his will, what he is determining to come to pass, and the external acts of God, the execution, his creation, his providence for all things, right? And how he executes the plan that he has inwardly. All important distinctions to make. And so this decree of God can be seen like a blueprint for all things that take place. It's not the bricklayer, right? It's not the bricklaying itself. It is the blueprint. The decree refers to God's internal inward plan, an act of his own mind and will, executed before the foundation of the world. The execution is the historical outworking of that plan. Right? Reformed theology distinguishes between the logical priority of the decree and its temporal execution. So, the decree, for example, God determines that Judas will betray Jesus. This makes the event certain. Right? It makes it a necessity. The execution. How does God execute the idea that he has determined Judas will betray Jesus? Does he take over Judas' body and make him do it? Does he whisper to do it in Judas' ear? No, of course God doesn't do that, right? The execution of God's decree in that story occurs in time. It involves Judas' psychology. It involves the currency of the area, the Sanhedrin politics, and, by the way, Satan's whispering in his ear. We see an example all through the book of Job, well, at least in the beginning of it, rather. We see the effects later, but we don't actually see Satan doing more past the beginning. But we see how Satan, what he does is introduced. We see how God asked him the question about Job, asked him to consider Job, and how all that began. We have a perfect example of how that takes place. And if sovereignty were merely causality, there would be no distinction between God thinking a thing and God doing a thing, right? We can make that distinction for ourselves. We can make that distinction for an animal, right? We can see a cat thinking about jumping, right? We can tell in its body language what it's thinking when it's doing that. But there's still a distinction between the cat thinking the thing and doing a thing, right? Scripture and theology distinguishes this. It's already a distinction that's been made for hundreds of years, right? God decrees it to rain, right? But God doesn't, right? We're not children. We don't think like God's crying and that's why it's raining, right? The cause of rain is evaporation. Does God decree rain or not, Christians? How far are you going to take your denial of God's sovereignty? Does God decree rain? Is God the cause, though? On this plane of existence, is God the cause of rain? No, right? It's evaporation and condensation, natural laws that God put into place so that when he has decreed it to rain, there's an agent to cause that. And it's not him, right? God decrees the cross, but the cause of the crucifixion is the hate of the Jews and the indifference of Pilate, right? They are the clouds and the chemical structure of the clouds causing the rain. God can only be said to be the cause in the sense that he is a creator. He does not cause the individual actions of people. He has decreed them. And how has God decreed things to take place, right? We talk about this all the time too, that there is an organic execution of God's decree. God does not execute his own decree. He has designed a universe which organically executes his decree. Bavinck has a significant contribution to this discussion. He warns against a mechanical view of providence where God moves men like chess pieces by hand, right? And so while this is Leighton Flower's favorite analogy on this, one of our best scholars warns against coming to a mindset like that. And yet Leighton Flowers puts that on us as if that is the mindset that we've come to. But again, God has displayed a preference for organics. And an organic universe is one where the parts are interconnected, right? They influence one another reciprocally. Right? The execution of the decree flows through the veins of history, genetics, culture, spiritual influence, as we see very clearly described in Scripture. Right? So the mechanical view is God pushes a button and Ahab lies. Right? I need Ahab to lie. In the organic view, God decrees judgment on Ahab. This decree is worked out through Ahab's history of idolatry, his psychological propensity to lie, to yes men, right? The geopolitical tension within Syria, and the spiritual reality of the heavenly council, the lying spirit. This organic execution means God's sovereignty is woven into the fabric of reality, not imposed as an alien force from above. The decree is like the soul of history itself. And history is the body that acts it out. This is Bavinck's argument. The organic worldview does justice to both the oneness, God's plan, and the diversity, creaturely actions of reality. And this is something I'm asked about actually very frequently. The next thing we're going to be covering, we're going to talk about supralapsarianism versus infralapsarianism and the decree. This is a debate that further highlights that Reformed theology does not view sovereignty as simple causality. And I know that I've heard Leighton refer to these terms before, and the existence of these terms mean that we don't believe that God's sovereignty equals causality. Right? Both sides of the debate. The logical order of decrees, right? Not the mechanical force of God's decree on nature. Supralapsarianism is God decrees the election and reprobation of men before the decree to create them. And infralapsarianism is God decrees to create, permit the fall, and then elects the elect and reprobate. So even in the higher view of supralapsarianism, God is not the efficient cause of sin. The reprobation is a decree to pass over, right, and condemn. But the ground of condemnation is the sin caused by the creature, not God. Calvin himself, often accused of extreme rigidity, argues that the cause and matter of perdition is in the wicked themselves. So you're not arguing against us, you're arguing against something you made up for us to believe. The statement sovereignty is causality becomes most pernicious when applied to evil. If God causes all things equally, then he causes sin. Reformed theology employs a specific metaphysical distinction to refute this. It's the difference between efficient and deficient causality. That's our next distinction that we have to draw. And these philosophical distinctions are important. They're not something that you can just wave a hand at. If these philosophical distinctions exist and can be supported with Scripture, then waving a hand at them is the opposite of conforming to sound doctrine. Unfortunately, that's been running rampant for the last couple of hundred of years, but this actually goes back a very long time. This goes back and originates with Augustine himself. Right? It's just been refined by scholastics like Turretin. This distinction asserts that sin is not a substance. Right? RC talks about this. Or a positive thing, right, that requires creation. We've talked about this. It's a privation of good, right? It perverts goodness, right? It's a lack of conformity or whole in righteousness, right? So you have the distinction between efficient cause and deficient cause. The efficient cause requires power and energy to produce a positive effect. Right? If you're going to paint a masterpiece, that requires a certain amount of power and energy to produce that masterpiece, right? If you're going to go feed the homeless, that requires a certain amount of power and energy to produce that effect, right? God is the efficient cause of all good. All things that are good, God is the efficient cause of. Then you have the deficient cause. This arises from a weakness or lack in the agent, right? Like a limp, for example. This is caused by a damaged leg, right? That the limp is not caused by the power of walking, right? The power and the energy that you have to walk is not causing your limp, right? You have a damaged leg, and that is causing the action of your limp. Though God is still sustaining the power of walking and sustaining the injury as it exists, right? It's not just disappearing spontaneously. It takes time to heal over an organic process, right? So when someone commits a sin, he is performing an action, right? And that action is efficiently caused by his will, but the action is sustained by God's power, right? God is sustaining the power that is required for the person to do the thing, right? If God wasn't doing that, they would cease to have power in them, right? They would not have the energy required to commit the act of violence or whatever it is, right? So the sinfulness of the action, that's a defect, right? It's a missing of the mark. God does not cause that defect like the limp in the sinful act. The defect arises because the creature came from nothing, ex nihilo, right? And is mutable. The creature is mutable. And we know what happened to that creature, right? John Frame notes that while some moderns might struggle with this distinction, asking if God causes the deficiency by creating a creature that's capable of it, right? The Reformed tradition consistently denies God is the author of sin, right? The cause of sin is the will of man turning away from good. God's role is he has decreed to permit this turning away, but he did not force the turning away by a positive infusion of evil. We know how the evil got there, right? We're conceived in sin. The evil got there during our conception, which was the secondary cause, right? What was the primary cause of our conception? God decreeing that the beings that are our mother and father to exist, decreeing the decreeing the manner of reproduction, right? Sustaining the power and energy required to do that, decreeing that it would take place, but yet also providing not puppets with a string to pull to make them mate with each other with desires to do so, right? And a legal system in which it's, allowed marriage. Those things all working together form the evil that is in your heart, not God positively infusing evil. That's John Frame's argument. The cause of sin is the will of man turning away from good. Right? Again, God's role is that he decreed to permit the turning away, but he did not force the turning away by a positive infusion of evil. God did not infuse them with evil, right? A process of reproduction infused them with evil. In summary, God's permission is sovereign. I'm not saying that it is a passive permission. That's an important distinction to make next, because Arminian theology often uses the term permission to mean God simply watches and allows what he cannot or chooses not to stop, implying the outcome is uncertain or outside his decree. But Reformed theology rejects bare permission. For Calvin, God's permission is active and willing. He gave them up, for example, in Romans 1. This is not a passive bystander letting an accident happen. It is a judge sentencing a criminal to their own desires. Right? The bare permission view is God thinking, I hope he doesn't do it, but I won't stop him if he does. Right? Sovereign permission is, I decree that he be allowed to follow his wicked heart to its natural end for my glory. In this sense, God is the remote cause by withdrawing his restraint, as James White often teaches, but not the proximate cause by doing the evil. The Westminster Confession states God's providence extends to the first fall and all other sins, and that not by a bare permission, but such as hath joined with it a most wise and powerful bounding. More evidence of the lack of truth in their understanding of our view of God's sovereignty, not causality, right? Very clearly, guys. I need more drink. Hang on. Okay, it's right here. Just 1 minute. In just 1 minute, guys, we're going to talk about my favorite case study. You guys know I talk about this all the time, the lying spirit, and I've actually laid it out even more than I usually do here, along the same lines of my, I guess you could say, essay here that I have. But I've been writing a lot for school, and so it's kind of been easier to do it in this format. Hope you guys are enjoying that kind of format of me writing it out and like kind of interjecting my own thoughts like in between what I've written. I've written a lot of this, and the next part is going to be on the lying spirit, one of my favorite stories. Why is it my favorite story, or one of my favorite stories? Is because I just love how in your face with it God is, and he doesn't care that you know this story. Like, as a matter of fact, he wants you to read your Bible and learn this story. Like, it's not bothering him that you're learning this about him sending a lying spirit to do his bidding. Like, it's not on his radar, is it? So the narrative that takes place here that we talk about all the time, 1 Kings 22:19 through 23. It's often cited by critics to prove that God is the author of deception. However, the Reformed analysis demonstrates that God employs secondary causes and judicial contexts, refuting the idea of direct causality of sin. All right, so the context of this narrative, King Ahab is a wicked idolater, right? He systematically rejected God's truth from all angles. He surrounds himself with 400 yes men prophets. Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, asked for a true prophet, and Micaiah is summoned. Micaiah reveals a vision of the divine council. The Lord asks, "Who shall persuade Ahab?" A spirit volunteers to be a lying spirit in the mouth of the prophets. The Lord says, "You shall persuade him. Go forth and do so." Right? You will succeed in this task. Now, we have to draw a distinction here because it's the perfect example to display what we're talking about. God's role versus the Spirit's role in this story. Right? If sovereignty is a mechanical causality, God would simply zap Ahab's brain to believe a lie, or maybe God would go down himself and lie to Ahab. Is God going to do that, though? Oh, God very clearly ordained this to take place because he called out and said he had a mission to perform. Who will do it, right? So instead, the text reveals a complex interaction of agencies in both realms here. So you've got the prophets, right? They're already false prophets. They desire to please Ahab, and they desire to continue to be false prophets simultaneously, right? Their nature is already bent towards this deception. It's their natural course, right? So you've got the Spirit, another secondary agent, right? It's probably a fallen angel or a personification of some kind of corrupted spirit of prophecy, something like that, who knows? He volunteers. The malice and intent to deceive belongs to the Spirit. Right? God didn't say, that he needed someone to lie. Where did the malice to do that come from, right? That requires malice to say that lying will be part of it. So who interjected that? Yeah, the lying spirit interjected that secondary cause. That's where the malice originates, right? So God, his role in the story, he sits as judge. He does not create the lie. He utilizes the ready and willing instrument, the lying spirit, to execute judgment on a man who loves lies. You love lies? Here's lies. God's not lying. He's not sinning. Now, the question is, will you now bring a charge against God for the utilization of lying spirits? If so, bring 1 Kings 22 with you, and so that you can point to God where this breaking of your law has taken place. It's right there in the scripture. Like I said, it's one of my favorite stories because God doesn't care that you know that he does this. It's not bothering him. Like he's not trying to hide it from you. In Calvin's commentary on this, Calvin argues that God wills Ahab to be deceived as a judgment. Right? The devil offers his agency and is sent with a definite command. Calvin admits this destroys the fiction of bare permission, but vehemently denies God is the author of the lie. The lie is the instrument of judgment, not the nature of God. It's the nature of the Spirit, it's the nature of the prophets, it's the nature of Ahab, not God. Now we're going to talk about judicial hardening, which is where Reformed theology categorizes this judicial hardening when men suppress the truth. Romans 1:18, God gives them over to a debased mind, right? So the causality, the efficient cause of the lie in our story is the spirit and the false prophets, right? God's sovereignty in that equation is demonstrated as his authority to use that lie for a righteous end, as in the death of a wicked king, right? Can you bring a charge against God for bringing about a righteous end with someone else's sinful act? What charge will you bring against him? He's already bringing a charge against the spirit for lying, right? He's bringing a charge against the spirit for lying. Are you too bringing a charge against God for this? It's covered. This sin is covered already. So what sin has God committed by utilizing the spirit in this way? Just as a judge might use a criminal's confession against him, God uses the lying spirit's nature against Ahab. God did not force the spirit to be a liar. The spirit was a liar. He was a lying spirit, right? God simply pointed that loaded you-know-what at Ahab. This is ordination, not the production of sin. Now, the betrayal of Jesus by Judas serves as probably the supreme and most important example in Scripture of the concurrence doctrine of God's absolute decree and man's free, responsible agency. Because the decree necessitates the certainty of the event. All right, Scripture is explicit that the betrayal was ordained. You can't get around it. Acts 22 or Acts 2:23. Jesus was delivered by the determinate counsel and foreknowledge of God. Acts 4:28. Herod and Pilate did whatever your hand and your purpose determined before to be done. Reformed theology embraces this. God decreed the betrayal. It wasn't plan B. It was the cornerstone of redemption. It was the cornerstone of God bringing himself glory with creation. That was the plan before anything. But what about the causality? So we can all agree as Christians that the cross was decreed by God, right? From at least, if you can't agree with before the foundation of the world, perhaps you can agree with what? Genesis 3? Maybe from Genesis 3, the cross was ordained. Surely as a Christian, you can at least give that, right? But what about the causality? We have the greed of Judas. We have the hatred of Israel. We have satanic influence, right? All of this was decreed by God. The text attributes the cause of the action to both Judas and Satan. John 12:6 says Judas was a thief. Basically, he was motivated by avarice, right? The prompt notes the fact that they exist in the way they are designed, right? Placed in a particular circumstance. They're all working together to cause these actions. Judas is acting out of the darkness that is in his own heart, right? He's not a robot. Right? He's willing to be a traitor to Jesus. This exists in his heart, right? And Satan's agency, which is clearly stated in Luke 22:3, John 13:27, Satan entered into Judas. Right? This indicates a spiritual efficient cause, or at least a powerful, exciting cause. Satan, in this scenario, acted according to his nature also, right? His nature to destroy Christ. But the willingness to do this is what makes Satan's influence have context in Judas's being, right? If Judas didn't have that darkness in his heart, then it would be like Jesus being tempted by Satan for 40 days. No luck, right? And so the doctrine of concurrence, divine concurrence, we have God, Satan, and Judas, right? We have three wills here. We have three agents willing the same event, all for different reasons and for different ends, right? Judas is willing the betrayal of Jesus for money, right? For his own greed that comes from his heart. That's where the battery is greed, right? Which lives in his heart. Why does Satan will it? He wants to destroy Christ, right? Judas didn't necessarily want to destroy Christ. He just probably was, the money was shining in his eye. You know what I mean? I'm sure he felt really bad about it, considering what he did afterwards. But regardless, we see those two wills, right? Divine concurrence includes God and his will for the salvation of his people, right? For his plan of redemption. Which of those three actions are evil, right? Obvious. Judas is willing to do it for money. Now, this is something that we can all agree on as Christians, right? Surely the Arminian, the Calvinist, the Provisionist, the Catholic can all find common ground on the idea that God ordained this sin to take place from the foundation of the world. And we see the doctrine of divine concurrence working in its most important capacity. One second. God's sovereignty is not his causality, right? He did not cause Judas's greed. God did not infuse greed into Judas. God decreed to place a greedy man, Judas, in a situation, right? He's the steward of the money bag. That's the situation, right? Where Satan would tempt him, right? And God withdrew the restraint that would have stopped him. Judas is responsible because he acted according to his nature. He was not forced. As R.C. Sproul himself notes, Judas and Satan were partners in crime, while God was the sovereign orchestrator who used their evil for his purposes and ultimately for good. As we see in our faith of what that caused, right? The death of Christ and followed by his resurrection. Christians, right? So this is all an organic unfolding, right? Not God causing people to betray Christ. Right? He's not causing that like a puppet master. He's decreeing and allowing it to unfold organically. He has designed an organic universe that acts out his decree organically, not by his own hand. Judas wasn't a glitch in the system. He was a branch on the tree of fallen humanity, right? His betrayal grew organically out of his own character, which developed organically from his life choices, all of which unfolded within the sovereign theater of God's decree, right? He chose those circumstances of his life. Surely not, right? All of the things of his life developed organically. To say that God caused Judas to betray Jesus in a mechanical sense ignores decades of character information, right? The specific temptations in that moment, the role of Satan in the story, all of which are secondary causes that are established by God and sustained by God. Where does Satan get the power and physical energy to enter someone? Right? It's sustained by God. He could cut the power source off at any conceivable moment, right? And so this is just an error of understanding. But to refute this causality equation, you have to adopt this organic motif. And this is not something I'm coming up with. Actually, at one time, I thought that, because I hadn't heard anyone describe it that way, and I thought that I was coming up with it. But actually, it was already popularized by someone else named Herman Bavinck, or Bavinck, however you want to say it. And he was very passionate about contrasting the mechanical view of God as operator of a machine universe, right? And he contrasts this with the organic view, the creation as a living organism that is sustained by God in all respects. So, in an organism like a body, right, the head determines the direction, but the hand grasps, the foot walks, right? The head does not walk for the foot. The foot walks because that is the function within the organism. God is the head or soul of the entire history of the universe. Humans, angels, and the laws of natures are the members. When the body moves, the head is sovereign, but the members act according to their specific properties, right? This model allows Reformed theology to affirm that God decrees all things without turning the universe into a lifeless machine where God is the only active gear. And that is kind of a little branch away from where I would take it. I don't think I would use that as much as Bavinck used that idea, but what I'm trying to do here is show you the different branches of philosophical thought that already exist that refute his idea that Calvinists think that causality equals God's sovereignty. Even people that slightly disagree with me on particular topics on this. I'm, for example, reading a lot from the Westminster Confession of Faith too, and a lot of people know how much of that I disagree with. Regardless, all of us don't believe that God's sovereignty equals causality. The Westminster Confession, again, emphasizes that God's decree establishes the liberty of secondary causes. This is counterintuitive to the determinist, but essential to the Calvinists. Calvinists are not determinists. Surprise, surprise, right? If God decreed that John will freely choose to sit down, then God's sovereignty requires John to have a kind of freedom of will. If God forces John to sit, God's decree, right, that he would sit freely, fails, right? Because that's not the decree. God doesn't decree, I will cause John to sit. God decrees something else causes John to sit, right? God could have decreed, I caused John to sit, but that's not what he did. And we know that. God's absolute sovereignty is the guarantee of human freedom in the way that humans have freedom. Right? God's sovereignty, the absoluteness of God's sovereignty is not the enemy of human freedom. It guarantees it. The mechanical causality view fails to understand that God can decree a contingent event, right? An event that could be otherwise, from the perspective of the agent, just as easily as he decrees a necessary event, right? Like the sun rising. And it's a common accusation that we see that Calvinism makes men puppets, right? This rests on this fallacy of sovereignty as causality. In that system, the strings, right, this external force where the kinetic energy is transferred by God causes the movement, right? And the puppet has no life force of its own, right? But in Reformed view of sovereignty, God gives the life, gives the breath, and gives a will to the creature. Right? The creature wouldn't have a specific kind of will unless God gave him one. He places the creature in a specific context in his life. He concurs their actions, right? As in he sustains them, provides the power that it takes to take those actions. The movement comes from the internal life of the creature given by God, sustained by God. The creature acts from his nature, not from some compulsion given by God in the moment, right? It's already, the nature has already come to be. This distinction is very important to Reformed anthropology. The statement that for the Calvinists and for John Calvin, God's sovereignty is his causality over all creation is nothing more than a reductionist fallacy. It fails to withstand scrutiny of Reformed theology. It ignores vital distinctions between, again, the first and secondary causes. God sustains the actor, but the actor performs the deed, right? Between the decree and execution. The plan of God is absolute. The execution of the plan is organic and contingent. The final distinction between the efficient and deficient causality, right? God creates the power, right? The creatures create the defects. Reformed theology from Calvin to the present day affirms that God is the sovereign Lord who ordains whatsoever comes to pass. Yet, it equally affirms that he does so in a way that the liberty or contingency of secondary causes is established. In the case of 1 Kings 22 and Judas Iscariot, we see the terrifying majesty of a God who can use the wicked intents of spirits and men to accomplish his holy purposes without ever becoming the efficient cause of their wickedness. He's the master of the entire universe, not the puppeteer of a machine. He rules an organic, living creation where men are real agents, responsible for their actions, even as those actions unfailingly fulfill the eternal counsel of his will. What we're trying to demonstrate is that the Reformed view of sovereignty is not some kind of stifling, rigid, mechanical determinism. It's a highly complex, mysterious invention of God that upholds the glory of God while preserving the significance of human life and action simultaneously. To fully grasp the Reformed rejection of sovereignty as causality, the debate between Calvinists and hyper-Calvinists, you have to traverse the historical corridor of theological development. It's, again, been written for hundreds of years. People have discussed this for a very long time, and it seems that our culture has just simply lost that information or doesn't care to take the time to go through it. The charge that Calvinism makes God the author of sin is not a new thing. Right? It wasn't a new thing when it was charged on Calvin. Right? It's the primary weapon of the Council of Trent and the Remonstrants. The Reformed defense against this charge reveals a sophisticated development of the concepts of necessity, contingency, and permission. Now we're going to talk about one of Leighton Flower's favorite topics, but I dare say he hasn't taken it in this direction ever before. We're going to talk about Augustine and the threat of the Manichaeans. Just a moment. Okay. This is a very important section because people like Idol Killer and Leighton Flowers often accuse Augustine of Manichaeanism, but in reality, the roots of the Reformed understanding lie in Augustine's battle against Manichaeanism. Manichaeans believed in a dualism, right? Where good and evil are equal, right? They are equal opposing forces. Evil is a substance. Augustine refuted this, arguing that evil is privatio boni, a deprivation of good. This metaphysical foundation is essential for later Reformed thought. If evil is not a substance, God does not need to create it. He creates an angel, right? The angel he creates is good. Then the angel turns away, becomes evil, right? The turning away is a defect in the angel, not a creation of God. Calvin, as you may know, leans heavily on Augustine in the Institutes. I'm going to read in 3.23.8, where Calvin cites Augustine to show that the will of God is necessity, yet man falls according to the appointment of divine providence, but he falls by his own fault. The distinction here is between the necessity of the event, right? It must happen because God foreknew it. and the cause of the event. It happens because man willed it to happen. Now, while Calvin was often rhetorical and pastoral, his successors, the Reformed scholastics, utilized the precise language of the schools to defend the doctrine. Francis Turretin, between 1623 and 1687, was perhaps the greatest of the Reformed scholastics, explicitly addresses this question: is God the author of sin? He distinguishes between the act, the physical motion, and the defect, right? The moral illegality of the action. The act, God is the efficient cause of, right? A murder needs life, breath, and muscle, right? The strength to do the action. God provides this, right? In him we move. God is not the cause of the defect in the murderer that causes the murder, right? The deviation from the law that says thou shalt not kill comes from the creature's heart, his will. It is the creature's will that deviates from the good law that God gave. Turretin uses the analogy of a musician playing a harp that has broken strings. The musician is the cause of the sound, the plucking, right? But the discordant nature of the sound is caused by the defect in the instrument. Thus, God drives the universe, but the discord of sin arises from the broken strings of fallen humanity. That again is Turretin's example. In a more modern era, you have Bavinck and Hodge, and there's actually a scientific challenge related to this as well that I was able to dig up. The challenge shifts from Catholic/Arminian theology in the modern era, right, to scientific determinism and materialism. People like Charles Hodge and Herman Bavinck had to defend sovereignty not just against free willers, free will libertarians, but against mechanical materialists who saw the universe as a clockwork like a clockwork mechanism. And the genius of Bavinck was to reframe the discussion from mechanism to organism. Right? In the mechanism, it suggests a deistic God who winds a clock, or a fatalistic God who pushes levers, right? An organism suggests a living, breathing cosmos where parts are interacting with each other organically to perform the function that God has ordained for them to perform. Bavinck argues that the mechanical view of inspiration, God dictating words like a stenographer, and the mechanical view of providence, God moving men like puppets, were errors of the same species. They both deny the reality of the secondary agent. By emphasizing the organic, Bavinck allows Reformed theology to interface with modern psychology and history. Right? Judas was not a robot, for example. They didn't know anything about robots in the 1500s, right? But that's the scientific angle. Judas is not a robot. He's a man with a psychology, a history, a spiritual nature, all of which are the organic means of executing God's decree for the man, right? The fact that all of God's creatures exist in the way that they are designed, right? They are placed in particular circumstances. All of those things are working together to cause the action of that thing, right? This requires a little bit of understanding of another doctrine and some psychology, but the doctrine of pneumatology, the doctrine of spirits in the Reformed view. Jonathan Edwards talked a lot about the psychology of the sinner in his freedom of the will, rather. He argued that the will is not a separate faculty that flips a coin. The will is the mind choosing. A man always chooses according to his strongest inclination at the moment. God orders the antecedent conditions, right? Heredity, environment, opportunity, all these things that form the man's character, right? And then the man acts according to that character. As in the case of Judas, God did not bypass Judas's mind to have him betray Christ. He included that into the equation, right? God ordained that Judas would be a man who loved money. John 12:6. God placed him in charge of the money bag, right? That's a circumstance. He put a man who he designed to love money in charge of the money bag. He put him in that circumstance, right? God allows Satan to suggest the betrayal. When Judas chose to betray, he did so because at that moment, the 30 pieces of silver and the desire to force Jesus' hand, or whatever his motive was his strongest inclination at that moment, right? He was free in that sense, in the sense that he did what he wanted to do to Jesus, right? He was destined in that God had arranged the universe so that this choice was possible and inevitable. Right? If God doesn't ordain a circumstance where God had, or where Judas has the opportunity to make this decision, it can never come to pass, right? This is not a mechanical compulsion introduced by God in the moment. It's a psychological certainty that Judas will perform this action. The person's whose psychology was designed by God. We want to revisit the 1 Kings 22 story during our discussion of pneumatology, because the role of the lying spirit in 1 Kings 22 is a matter of pneumatology, right? Reformed theology rejects the idea that spirits possess men in a way that bypasses their will, except in cases of extreme demonization where the person is a victim. That's a different story, but not like in the case of Ahab. This is a different kind, right? We have suggestions and temptations. The spirits work on the imagination of the person and the desires of the person. The lying spirit in 1 Kings 22 likely inspired the false prophets by inflaming their desire for victory, right? Their sycophancy toward Ahab, providing them the necessary elements for the lie that they would tell to Ahab, right? The mouth of the prophets, the text says, I will be a lying spirit in the mouth of all of his prophets, right? This implies a speech, right? The prophets are going to be speaking. The prophets spoke the lie. They are the ones who spoke the lie. They believed it when the Spirit influenced them with it, right? The Spirit provides the impetus, right? The content. But the prophets provide the consent, right? God's sovereignty is here, the master of all of that, right? He knows exactly what influences are going to be required to tip the scales of Ahab's already wicked heart towards something like Ramoth Gilead, right? He's already wicked. Ramoth Gilead's there. Now we just need a lying spirit to incite his prophets to lie. Here's the lie. All right. Now he goes up to Ramoth Gilead and God's decree is fulfilled. And I double dog dare you to bring a charge against God for doing that. It's right here in Scripture. Bring it with you, you know? Back to the Westminster Confession of Faith. Just to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that they are wrong. The Calvinistic definition of God's sovereignty is not equivalent to causality. WCF 3.1 denies God as the author of sin emphatically, right? It affirms the liberty of secondary causes. WCF 5.2 states, although in relation to the foreknowledge and decree of God, the first cause, all things come to pass immutably and infallibly, yet by the same providence he ordereth them to fall out according to the nature of secondary causes, either necessarily, freely, or contingently. It leaves it open to three different views, right, that you could have for various actions, none of which are God's causality. It's the nail in the coffin for the idea that this is what Calvinists believe. It's there in the confession. And you know that I'm not a confessionalist. I'm presenting it here because it's the fact of the matter. Calvinists do not believe God's sovereignty equals causality. I know I trolled you with the idea that all non-Calvinists are practically atheists, whatever. That's not what we're here to talk about. We're here to talk about why is Leighton Flowers eternally putting this false doctrine on us as if we believe it when we don't, and we've explained it to him more times than can be counted in many different venues. These two statements alone from the WCF puts a nail in the coffin. Explicitly states that contingency, things that could be otherwise, right, are part of God's plan. Let's look at the Canons of Dort from 1619. Right, written specifically to refute Arminianism. The Canons of Dort are surprisingly careful to limit God's causality regarding sin. Article 1.5 says, the cause or blame for this unbelief, as well as for all other sins, is not at all in God, but in man. The canon rejects the idea that God compels men to sin. The fall of Adam and the rejection of the gospel are traced to the perverse will of the creature and the temptations that fall upon them. Now, the tulip itself rests on the premise that man is dead in his sin, right? That's the first one, total depravity, and therefore needs God to be the efficient cause of his salvation, right? That's monergism. But regarding damnation, man is the efficient cause, right? That's a monergism of the sinner. God is the Savior. Man and Satan are the destroyers, right? Satan has, with his lie in the garden, recruited man into his role as the destroyer, right? This asymmetry is essential. Sovereignty as causality creates a symmetry. God causes good and evil equally. That Reformed theology not only rejects but abhors. The Heidelberg Catechism, 1563. Lord's Day 10 deals with providence. It defines it as the almighty and everywhere present power of God, so that herbs and grass, rain and drought, fruitful and barren years, meat and drink, health and sickness, riches and poverty, yeah, all things come not by chance, but by his fatherly hand. Critics seize on the all things come by his hand, right? But Bavinck interprets this not as a mechanical hand moving pieces, but as a fatherly hand sustaining the environment of life. It is a context of care and sustenance, or provision, as our friends like to employ. Right? Even in adversity, though. The Catechism focuses on the reception of events by the believer, patience in adversity, not the metaphysical production of the sinful acts of enemies. Now, again, like I said, Calvinists are actually not determinists, guys, because Reformed theology is a compatibilist theology. Which incorporates aspects of determinism, but there are different branches, right? The aspect of determinism that we affirm is the sense of God's decree is absolute, right? What he has decreed is necessary to take place and will take place. However, there is a form of a freedom of will that man possesses, right? In the sense of acting according to his own desire. That is in the equation as well. Compatibilism is the idea that those two things are compatible, not that God is the cause. It's the idea that those two things are compatible. Now, incompatibilism, which is held by both Arminians and hyper-Calvinists, by the way, argues that if God decrees it, man cannot be free. Right? Arminians say man is free, so God cannot have decreed it. Hyper-Calvinists say God decreed it, so man acts mechanically. But the refutation of this equation stands on the philosophical distinction that the source of the certainty is from God, but the source of the action is from man. And now there is, of course, a certain mystery involved with the doctrine of concursus, because we don't understand everything. Ultimately, Reformed theology admits that there's a certain level of mystery to this doctrine of how can God be 100% sovereign and man also 100% free, in the sense that he can act according to his nature and is responsible for doing so. We can distinguish the causes, right? We can distinguish that. The first cause, the second cause, right? We can distinguish the planes that they come from and where the action comes from. We've discussed all of that. We can define all the terms, efficient versus deficient. If we can define those terms philosophically, right, and we can analyze the psychology of the inclination versus the compulsion, where the infinite spirit touches the finite to sustain it without coercing it, right? If we can describe that, then it should be comprehensible to the Christian. Now, Calvin says, I will not hesitate simply to confess with Augustine that the will of God is necessity, but the cause and matter of perdition is in the wicked. And this confession of mystery is not some kind of a cop-out. Right? There's a certain kind of rationality that leads to the sovereignty equals causality error that these men are making here. And the idea that mystery is involved with the things God has not revealed to us is a solid biblical concept. And we couldn't possibly know what all things could possibly be secondary causes for what. There's no way that we could know that. But like a rationalist view wants a clean equation here, like God equals cause, right? The true Christian theologian is going to accept the complex reality that Scripture presents. And so this is our final summary here. Okay. We've got the charge. The charge is that for the Calvinists, God's sovereignty is his causality over all of creation. The refutation is that, number one, this is a false equivalence, right? You have confused authority with efficiency, sovereignty with causality. King is sovereign over his realm, but he does not plow every field himself, right? God governs all, but he utilizes the plowing of secondary agents for his purposes, right? They are introducing the author of sin fallacy. The definition they give, God's sovereignty equals causality. That's a definition that makes God the creator of malice, a point that all of our confessions vehemently deny and make a point to deny in every written form, right? Reformed theology explicitly denies this idea. With the Augustine's privatio boni and the deficient cause, right? God creates the sword, right? The power, but the murderer provides the thrust, right? The malice. God provides the energy to do so, but the creature provides the intent to do so. God's decree is not a script read by robots. It's a blueprint built by living stones. 1 Kings 22 and the story of Judas prove that God weaves the independent, wicked desires of creatures into his plan. He does not need to hypnotize Ahab. He needs only to let Ahab be Ahab, and let the lying spirit be a lying spirit, and let the result be Ahab's judgment. Finally, one of the most important distinctions to make here is the creator-creature distinction that we hear James White harp on all the time. God is the cause only as the one who gives being. He is not the cause of the mode of the action in that way, right? The mode of the action is caused by the internal will of the creature acting. Right? He gives existence to the creature, and he gives all of the things that are involved with that. But the creature determines the what, right? He gives the that. The creature determines the what, right? The moral quality within the bounds of God's restraint. The Reformed doctrine of sovereignty is not the crushing weight of some kind of celestial piston. It's like a symphonic conducting of an orchestra, right? The composer writes the music. That's the decree, right? He holds the baton, his sovereignty and providence. The players, the secondary causes, they play the instruments. Right? If a player plays a wrong note, the sin, it's because of the player's defect. But the conductor is so masterful that he incorporates even the discordant note into the final resolution of his glorious symphony. This is the God of John Calvin, the God of the Westminster Confessions, and the Bible. Is absolutely sovereign, yet holy and distinct from the sins of his creatures. What kind of questions do we have out there? I haven't talked to you guys. I see there's quite a few. See, there's quite a few people messaging out there in the chat. So let's put on a little music or something, and we'll just answer some questions for a little bit if you guys have any about what we just talked about. How is this not circular and just moving the buck? What do you mean? Oh yeah, for sure. Definitely non-Calvinists are practically atheists. They might as well be. They don't believe in the real God of the universe. They don't believe in a God in that sense, right? They don't believe in all of the faculties that makes God God, right? So they don't believe in a God. They believe in something else that's not God. So they might as well be atheists. That's the idea. You believe in some kind of entity who's not God. He's not the way that God is described in the Bible. This is the way God is described. And so if you believe in something else, you just believe in something else. You know, you might as well be atheist. Might as well be just like an atheist who believes in like an incredibly advanced alien that just almost has the powers of God, but not all the way. Yeah, I do agree with that statement about non-Calvinists being basically atheists, but that was not the point of our discussion today. How's it going, Sugoi? What's going on, man? Yeah, I was muted earlier during the intro. That was unfortunate. Yeah, about God sustaining the actions of humans. Right, like it takes a certain level of kinetic energy for an action to be performed, right? And that kinetic energy has to be sustained in reality, right? For the action to be followed through, right? Like if I start hurting someone and it takes me 10 minutes, to hurt them, God's sustaining my being for that whole 10 minutes, right? Like actively sustaining my being. If he wasn't, then, right? Because in him I live and move and have my being. And so if at any moment I don't live and move and have my being in God, then I cease to exist or do anything, right? If I cease to move in God, then I cease to move. God has to sustain the fact that that kinetic energy still exists and has context in the universe, right? He has to uphold all of those things while I'm committing my sin. Or I would not be able to do so. Right? I might just completely pop out of existence. He said, I like men. I mean, I like men too. As far as men go, I guess. I mean, they're all right. I guess I wouldn't really say that I like them. I guess I like some men. That's a weird thing to say. Still with double predestination. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Still with double predestination. Right, because the double predestination is part of the decree, right? The destination of those two parties is still part of the decree. It's absolute. It's their reprobation is a necessity of reality, right? It can be no other way. That is true. Yes. Double predestination still on. Even so, the actions that this person takes that he is judged by, right? The judgment that leads to his damnation, those actions are performed by their will, right? They're performed by their bodies and instigated by their will, tempted by various influences, and allowed to be possible by God's providence and his sustaining of not only the universe, but their particular mass of cells in the context of the thing they're doing. Yeah. And why Flowers, after so many years, would not be making all the proper distinctions when trying to refute Calvinism shows that he doesn't have a desire to refute Calvinism at all. He wants to put Calvinism in a straw man and then beat the straw man. Like, why? Why do you want to do that? I don't know. Let me check and see if there's been an update in the chat at all. Okay, that wasn't as bad as I thought. Just 2 hours. Not bad at all. I think we got through that little essay pretty good. So guys, if there's not any more questions, I'm probably going to go ahead and hit the road. And I hope you guys enjoyed it. Hope you learned a few things. I know I repeated myself a lot, but it's important to hammer these things in. These distinctions are important. They've already been laid out for a long time. They're not going anywhere. So, Leighton Flowers, if you're listening, you might as well let these distinctions exist when you argue with Reformed theology with no one standing there supporting Reformed theology around you, right? Don't lie and say that our view of God's sovereignty equals causality when you know good and well that it doesn't. None of the stuff that I said in this video is a mystery to Leighton Flowers. All right, he's been studying it every day for his entire life, basically. You don't know that stuff? You don't know the stuff that proves that Calvinists don't view God's sovereignty as causality? Surely. Surely you do. All right.